I can still hear the sound of it, hundreds of people gasping at once. It wasn't the kind of sound you hear at a concert or a football game. It was sharper, like a sudden intake of breath before someone bursts into tears. And then I realized they were looking at me. I looked down on my feet, half expecting to see the wheelchair I'd been chained to for nearly 2 years. But it wasn't there. My hands weren't gripping the cold metal armrests. My legs, my useless, dead-weight legs, were holding me up. I was standing. For a moment, the air felt heavier, like the whole room was holding its breath with me. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. I could feel my shoes pressing into the wooden floor. And then, I took a step. The first step didn't feel real. It felt like my brain was playing some cruel trick, like I'd wake up and hear the hospital beeping again, smell that awful disinfectant. But the warmth of the floor, the trembling in my knees, and the sound of my shoes scuffing the wood told me this was no dream. Somewhere behind me, I heard my son crying. Not the quiet kind of crying either. The kind where your whole body shakes, and you don't care who sees. The preacher's hand was still resting on my shoulder, his voice a low murmur of prayer I could barely hear over the pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if my heart was racing from joy or from terror. Maybe both. It was at that exact moment, with my legs trembling under my own weight for the first time since the stroke, that I realized something. To understand how I got here, to this wooden floor under these blinding lights in this church miles from home, you'd have to go back. Back to the day everything I thought I knew about life collapsed in an instant. 2 years earlier, I was a different man. I mean, really different. I didn't just walk, I ran. I built things. I fixed things. I carried heavy boxes up flights of stairs without thinking twice. If you'd told me then that in less than a year I'd need help just to get out of bed, I would have laughed in your face. I wasn't a perfect man, far from it, but I was proud of what I could do with my own 2 hands. I was proud that I'd raised a son who looked up to me. And if I'm honest, I thought that made me untouchable. But that's the funny thing about life. It doesn't ask you if you're ready before it knocks you flat. For me, it happened on a Tuesday. I was in the kitchen, nothing unusual, just buttering toast, the news mumbling in the background. And then it was like the world tilted sideways. My right hand dropped the knife. The toast slid to the floor. My vision blurred so badly I couldn't even see where it landed. And then the strangest thing, I knew something was wrong, but my mouth wouldn't move to call for help. It was like being trapped inside my own skull while my body shut down one piece at a time. My knees buckled. The cold tiles slammed into my shoulder. I remember trying to roll onto my side, but my body wouldn't obey. All I could hear was the faint sound of the news anchor's voice fading into static in my ears. That's the last thing I remember before waking up in a hospital bed. The room was dim, the blinds half closed. There was a beeping that seemed to echo inside my skull. My throat was dry, like I'd swallowed sand. I turned my head slowly, painfully, and saw my son sitting by the window. His face was pale and scared in a way I had never seen before. "Dad?" He whispered, like he wasn't sure if I'd answer. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a hoarse croak. The look in his eyes told me he was trying not to cry. That's when I saw the wheelchair parked in the corner. Even before the doctor said the words, some part of me knew my legs weren't mine anymore. If I had known then where that moment would lead me, the months of pain, the loneliness, the doubt, the feeling that my life was over, I'm not sure I would have had the strength to face it. But I didn't know. All I knew was that I couldn't walk, and the doctors didn't seem to think I ever would again. And yet, here I am, walking. What happened between that Tuesday morning and this moment inside the church? Well, that's the story I want to tell you. And if you're willing to hear it, I'll take you through every second. Before the stroke, my life felt full. Not perfect, not without its headaches, but full. The kind of life where you fall asleep at night tired from doing something that mattered, even if it was just fixing a neighbor's fence or helping a friend move a couch. I worked with my hands for most of my life. Carpentry, small repairs, a little bit of electrical work when I was feeling brave. My workshop in the garage was my kingdom, a place that smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and old coffee. If I wasn't at work, I was in there. I used to joke that my tools knew me better than most people did. My mornings had a rhythm. Up before sunrise, coffee in the same chipped mug I'd had since my 20s, news humming on the TV while I checked the day's work schedule. And then, out the door before the world was even fully awake. I liked it that way. My son, David, would sometimes meet me for breakfast before he went to his own job. He's the kind of young man you hope your son will grow into: decent, hardworking, with a heart that sees people for who they are. Even back then, before life started to bend and twist in ways we couldn't imagine, I knew I was proud of him. We had our traditions. Sunday dinners, even if it meant one of us had to drive an hour. Fishing trips in the summer. Watching football on the radio when the TV signal went out at the cabin. He'd bring over his laundry sometimes, and I'd pretend to be annoyed, but I secretly loved it. Those little things, they're what make a life rich. I wasn't much of a churchgoer at that point. Not because I didn't believe, but because life had a way of filling the calendar with other things. Faith, for me, had become more of a quiet understanding than something I practiced out loud. I figured God knew my heart, and that was enough. But looking back, I can see the little nudges, moments I didn't think much about at the time. Like the old woman at the grocery store who stopped me one day, touched my arm, and told me to never take my health for granted. Or the day David mentioned a preacher he'd been listening to online, his eyes lighting up in a way I hadn't seen since he was a kid talking about superheroes. I brushed those moments off back then. After all, I was healthy, strong. I could still beat most guys my age in an arm wrestling match. Why would I think about what life would be like if I couldn't? There's one memory that stands out now, though I didn't realize its weight at the time. It was late autumn, one of those crisp mornings when the air smells like wood smoke. I was helping David fix a squeaky door at his apartment. He offered me a chair, but I waved him off and said, "Son, I'll sit when I'm old." He laughed, shook his head, and said, "You're never going to slow down, are you?" I told him, "Not unless someone makes me." If I'd known how soon that someone would arrive, and that it wouldn't be a person, but a sudden, merciless attack on my own body, maybe I would have sat down that day. Maybe I would have lingered longer, just talking to my boy. Life before the stroke wasn't perfect, but it had structure. I had the comfort of knowing who I was and what I could do. And I didn't realize how much of my identity was wrapped up in my independence until the day it was ripped from me. People say you don't appreciate something until it's gone, but that's not entirely true. I appreciated my life back then. I just thought it would last forever. The thing about losing everything you think defines you is you start to learn who you are without it. And that's not always a pretty lesson. By the time a stroke hit, I had no warning signs, at least none I recognized. Looking back, maybe I was a little more tired than usual. Maybe I ignored a few headaches. But nothing that screamed your life is about to change forever. And when it did change, I wasn't ready. David wasn't ready. No one was. But that's where our story truly begins, with the shattering of the life I knew and the start of a journey I never could have predicted. It's strange how quickly the human mind can go from ordinary thoughts to the edge of panic. One second, I was thinking about whether I had enough butter for the toast. The next, I was wondering if I was about to die on my kitchen floor. When a stroke hit, time didn't slow down like people say. It didn't feel cinematic. It felt wrong. Like my body had been unplugged from itself. The knife dropped from my hand first. My arm felt like it belonged to someone else. I opened my mouth to call out, but the words tangled somewhere between my brain and my lips. A sour taste filled my mouth. My vision melted at the edges, like a photo left out in the rain. I stumbled toward the table, but my right leg buckled. The coal tiles smacked my shoulder and knocked the air out of me. I tried to push myself up, but my body ignored me. That's when the fear really set in. Not just fear of dying, but fear of being trapped like this forever. I don't remember calling David. I'm told I didn't. He just happened to stop by after his shift because he had a feeling something was wrong. When he walked in, I was lying on the floor, half conscious, my breath ragged. He told me later that my eyes looked like they were searching for him, but couldn't quite focus. He shouted my name, knelt beside me, and called for an ambulance. His voice was firm, but I could hear the tremor underneath. He kept talking to me the whole time. "Stay with me, Dad. You're going to be okay." I couldn't answer. All I could do was blink. The paramedics arrived quickly. They moved with that calm urgency that tells you they've seen this before. A blood pressure cuff, an oxygen mask, questions I couldn't answer. Then I was on a stretcher, the kitchen lights spinning above me as they wheeled me out the door. The hospital was chaos, fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, the squeak of rubber saws. I could hear beeping and voices, but they all seemed far away, muffled like I was underwater. Someone was saying stroke, another was saying clot, and then came a rush of medical terms I didn't understand. They wheeled me into a CT scan, and by the time I came out, David was standing in the hallway, talking to a doctor. His face told me everything before I even heard the words. There's been significant damage. We can treat the clot, but the prognosis for mobility is poor. Poor. That was the word they used. Like my legs were a bad investment, they didn't expect to recover. The days that followed were a blur of tubes, needles, and tests. Nurses checking vitals. Doctors explaining things to David while I listened in fragments. They told me I was lucky to be alive, but all I could think was that I didn't feel lucky. I felt broken. Then came the rehab ward. It smelled different, less like antiseptic, more like stale coffee and cleaning spray. The first time the physical therapist tried to get me to stand, I thought my legs might snap under my own weight. My right side felt heavy, sluggish, like it had been filled with wet sand. They had me gripping parallel bars, shuffling one foot forward, then the other. The smallest movements made me sweat like I'd run a mile. I get frustrated, snapping at the therapist, at myself, even at David when he tried to encourage me. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was the feeling of being a burden. Weeks turned into months. I measure my life in therapy sessions and hospital meals. My independence shrank to whatever I could reach from a wheelchair. I hated needing help with everything, dressing, showering, even opening a bottle of water. David visited almost every day. Sometimes he brought books or played my favorite old songs just to break the monotony. Other times we sat in silence, watching the clock tick toward another round of therapy. He never said it out loud, but I knew he missed the version of me who could meet him for breakfast or toss a football in the backyard. There was one evening that still sticks with me. The rain was pounding against the rehab center windows, and the air smelled like damp carpet. I was staring at my useless legs when David pulled a chair beside my bed and said, "You used to tell me nothing was impossible if I worked hard enough." He paused, his voice tightening. "I need you to believe that now, for yourself." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the man I used to be was still in there somewhere, buried under the weakness and frustration. But most nights, I fell asleep wondering if this was it, if I'd spend the rest of my life being pushed instead of walking on my own. One night, after a particularly grueling therapy session, I told him to stop coming so much, that he had his own life to live. He just looked at me and said, "You're my dad. That's my life." There was one night, late after the halls had gone quiet, when I sat in my wheelchair staring at the moonlight spilling across the linoleum floor. I could hear the faint hum of the vending machine down the hall and the distant beep of another patient's monitor. It hit me then, harder than it had before. If this was my life now, I didn't know if I had the strength to keep going. My hands gripped the wheels so tightly my knuckles ached. That was the night I silently prayed for something, anything, to change. I didn't know it then, but that prayer was already on its way to being answered. It started with little hints, though I didn't realize what he was getting at in the beginning. David would drop by after work, sit beside my wheelchair, and tell me about someone he'd seen on TV or online, a preacher from a church that was doing incredible things. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I figured it was just another inspirational story making the rounds on social media. But the way his eyes lit up when he talked about it, I could tell it meant more to him than just entertainment. One evening, he pulled out his phone and said, "Dad, you've got to see this." On the screen was a grainy video of a man, maybe in his 50s, standing at the front of a packed church. His voice was strong but kind, the kind that pulls you in without you realizing it. In the clip, he was praying over a woman in a wheelchair. Her head was bowed, tears streaming down her face. When she stood, shaky but upright, the congregation erupted into shouts and applause. I handed the phone back to David. "That's something," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "It's not just something," he replied. "It's real. I've been following this guy for months. People are being healed, Dad. not just in their hearts, in their bodies. People who couldn't walk, walking again. I looked at him, and I could see it, that stubborn streak he'd had since he was a kid, the one that never gave up on anything he believed in. I wanted to tell him no. I wanted to say I'd seen enough false hope to last a lifetime. But the truth was, part of me was afraid. Not afraid it wouldn't work, but afraid it would. Afraid of what it would mean if I stood up and realized I'd been wrong about everything I thought I knew. You think I'm just going to roll into some church and walk out like nothing happened? I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I think you should give it a chance, David said quietly. What's the worst that could happen? I didn't answer right away. The worst, I thought, would be walking out of that church exactly the same as I went in, only with one more piece of my hope gone. Days passed, and he didn't bring it up again. Or maybe he didn't need to, because I couldn't stop thinking about it. That preacher's voice, that woman standing, the sound of the crowd cheering. I found myself wondering, late at night, what it would feel like to take a step again without the parallel bars, without someone holding me up. One night, over dinner, David finally asked, "Will you come with me?" I stared at my plate, pushing food around with my fork. My first instinct was to say no, but then I thought about that prayer I'd whispered in the quiet, that plea for anything to change. "All right," I said, my voice low. "I'll go." David didn't grin or cheer. He just nodded, like he'd been expecting the answer all along. The day we left, the sky was the color of steel. David loaded my wheelchair into the trunk, then helped me into the passenger seat. The air was cold, and I could smell the faint scent of rain. We didn't talk much during the drive, just the hum of the tires and the occasional click of the turn signal. But inside my head, it was anything but quiet. I kept replaying every failed therapy session, every time the doctors told me walking again was unlikely. I thought about all the people who'd prayed for me before, the well-meaning friends who said, "God has a plan," while I sat in my chair wondering if that plan was for me to never stand again. And yet, a tiny spark had lit inside me the moment I said yes. I didn't know if it was hope or just the curiosity of a man who'd run out of other options. As we got closer, David finally broke the silence. "I don't know what's going to happen today, Dad, but I believe something will." I glanced at him. "You really think this preacher can make me walk?" "I think God can," he said simply. "And I think this man's the one he's going to use." I didn't know if I believed him, but I couldn't deny that for the first time in a long time, I wanted to. When we pulled into the church parking lot, I felt my chest tighten. The building wasn't anything fancy, just brick walls and a tall white steeple. But the line of people waiting to get inside stretched halfway around the block. Some were in wheelchairs, some on crutches. All of them, like me, looking for something they couldn't find anywhere else. David got out, grabbed my chair from the trunk, and wheeled me toward the entrance. As the doors opened and the sound of music poured out, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. The sense that I was stepping into the unknown, and that maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. The moment we crossed the threshold, the sound hit me first. It wasn't just music. It was a wall of voices, hundreds of them, layered over the thump of a bass and the swell of an organ. I'd expected something quiet and reverent, but this was alive. The air seemed to vibrate with it. David wheeled me down a side aisle, weaving between rows of folding chairs packed tight with people. Some stood with their eyes closed, hands raised, swaying like they were caught in a current only they could feel. Others knelt, their lips moving in silent prayer. The smell was a mix of perfume, aftershave, and something faintly like candle wax, even though I didn't see a single candle. Warm light poured from hanging fixtures above, giving everything a golden hue that made the air feel thick, almost heavy. We stopped about halfway to the front, near an aisle. From here, I could see the stage, if you could call it that. It wasn't raised high, just a simple wooden platform with a pulpit in the center. Behind it, a choir swayed in perfect rhythm to the music, their voices weaving together into a sound that felt both powerful and strangely intimate. And then I saw him. The preacher wasn't what I'd pictured. No flashy suit, no television smile. He wore a simple dark jacket and a white shirt with the top button undone. But there was something about the way he moved, like every step had purpose. His eyes scanned the crowd, and even though he was still a good 20 feet away, I had the uneasy feeling that if they met mine, he'd see straight through me. The music began to fade, replaced by a hush that felt almost heavier than the sound. The preacher stepped to the pulpit, resting his hands on the sides. "Some of you came here today carrying more than your body can bear," he began. His voice was deep, warm, but with an undercurrent of something sharper. "You've been told there's no hope. You've been told the door is closed. But the God I serve," he paused, letting the silence stretch. "He still opens doors no man can shut." The congregation murmured in agreement, some whispering amen. I shifted in my chair, trying to keep my face neutral. I'd heard words like that before, from well-meaning people who didn't have to live with legs that felt like dead weight. David leaned closer. "He's talking to you," he said quietly. I snorted under my breath, but didn't answer. As the preacher spoke, he began moving down the steps and into the crowd. He laid hands on people as he passed, murmuring prayers. Some wept, some laughed. One man let out a sharp cry and collapsed his knees. I told myself I was just an observer, that I was here for David's sake, not mine. But my heart wouldn't slow down. The preacher stopped in front of a young woman with a brace on her leg. He placed a hand on her shoulder, whispered something I couldn't hear, and then stepped back. She hesitated and then took a step without the brace locking. The crowd erupted, but the preacher didn't bask in it. He simply nodded and moved on, like this was nothing new to him. I felt David's hand squeeze my shoulder. "You see that?" he whispered. "I saw," I said, keeping my voice low. But in truth, I didn't know what I saw. My mind wanted to dismiss it, to find an explanation, a fluke, a trick of the eyes. But my chest felt tight, like something inside me was bracing for impact. The preacher worked his way through the crowd slowly, like he had all the time in the world. He wasn't in a hurry, and the people weren't either. Every few minutes, a ripple of excitement would move through the room. Someone healed, someone breaking down in relief. I caught myself wondering what it would feel like if that happened to me. The thought made my stomach clench. Hope was dangerous when you'd been disappointed as many times as I had. David must have seen something in my face because he leaned down and said, "Don't fight it, Dad. Just let yourself be here." About 15 minutes in, I made the mistake of locking eyes with the preacher. It wasn't just a glance. It was like he'd been looking for me the whole time. He started walking toward me, the crowd parting without him saying a word. Every step he took seemed louder than the music that had been playing minutes before. I could feel David's grip on my shoulder tighten. When he reached me, he crouched down so we were eye level. "What's your name, sir?" "John," I said, my voice catching in my throat. He smiled slightly, not in a way that felt rehearsed, but like he'd just heard a name he already knew. "John," he said softly, "how long have you been in that chair?" 2 years, I replied. He nodded, studying my face for a long moment. Then he said something that froze me, today is the last day you'll be in it. The words hung in the air like a challenge. My rational mind screamed, "Don't believe it." But something deeper, the same part of me that had whispered that desperate prayer in the moonlight, stirred. The preacher extended his hand. "Will you come forward with me?" I glanced at David. His eyes were shining, not with tears this time, but with the fierce determination I'd seen when he was a boy learning to ride a bike. I took a breath. "All right," I said. David stood, moving behind me to push the chair, but the preacher shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "Let's try something different." And with that, he held out his hand again, not to will me forward, but to help me stand. The preacher's hand was warm, steady, not the kind of grip you give someone when you're just helping them up, but the kind you give when you believe without question that they will get up. For a moment, I just stared at it. My own hand twitched on the armrest of my chair. 2 years of sitting there had trained my mind to skip past the idea of standing. It was like asking a man without wings to fly. "John," the preacher said softly, "you don't have to do this alone." Something in his tone cut through my fear. Slowly, I reached out. My fingers wrapped around his, and I felt David's hand slip from my shoulder to hover just behind me, ready to catch me if I fell. I pushed down on the armrest with my free hand. My legs trembled instantly, like they remembered exactly why they'd stopped holding me up in the first place. Pain shot through my right thigh, sharp enough to make me gasp. "You're all right," the preacher murmured. One step at a time. The crowd had gone utterly silent. Even the music had faded into nothing. I could hear my own breath, shallow and uneven, and the faint buzz of the lights above. Then my left foot shifted. Not much, just enough for my heel to scrape the floor. But it was movement, real movement. A murmur rippled through the congregation. I pressed harder, willing my right leg to follow. For a second, it resisted, heavy and unresponsive. And then, like a locked door creaking open, the muscle twitched. My knees straightened just enough to bear weight. I was half standing now, leaning heavily on the preacher's grip. David's breath hitched. "Dad," I didn't look at him. I couldn't. If I did, I might lose my focus. In my head, images flashed. The parallel bars in the rehab center, the cold tiles on my kitchen floor, the nights staring at the moonlight on linoleum. All those times I tried to stand and failed, and here I was again, except this time, something felt different. "Let's walk," the preacher said simply. Walk. The word felt impossible and natural all at once. My first step was awkward, more of a shuffle than anything else. My calf burned, my hip ached, but when my foot landed, the room erupted. Cheers, clapping, voices crying out thanks to God. The preacher didn't let go. He took a slow step backward, guiding me forward. My second step was stronger. My third, steadier. Blood rushed into muscles that had been sleeping for years, and every fiber of me screamed in protest. But it was the best pain I'd ever felt. By the fourth step, my balance returned enough that I wasn't clinging to him so tightly. The preacher smiled, not at me, but at David. David was crying, not quietly, but the kind of crying where your whole face changes. His hands were clasped over his mouth like he was afraid if he let go, the moment would vanish. I could see his shoulders shaking, his eyes locked on my feet like they were the most important thing in the world. "Keep going, John," the preacher urged. "You're doing it." I was doing it. My mind still couldn't catch up to what my body was doing, but my feet were moving, one in front of the other, carrying me toward the front of the church. When we reached the pulpit, the preacher let go, stepping aside. "Take another step, John." My heart pounded. For the first time in 2 years, no one was holding me up. I could feel the blood in my ears, the trembling in my knees, the sweat trickling down my back. I took a deep breath and stepped forward on my own. The crowd roared. Hands clapped, voices shouted, and somewhere in the back, I heard someone sobbing. The choir's voices swelled again, this time without instruments, singing words I couldn't quite catch. I turned toward David. His tears were streaming, but his smile was the widest I'd ever seen. He didn't move to catch me. He didn't need to, because I was standing, and for the first time in 2 years. I wasn't afraid of falling. In the days after the service, I kept expecting to wake up back in the wheelchair. I'd stand in my living room, shifting my weight from one foot to the other, waiting for the weakness to come flooding back. But it didn't. The strength in my legs wasn't perfect. I still moved slower than I used to, but they were mine again. Every morning, I'd take a walk down the driveway, just to remind myself it was real. David came by almost every day that first week. Sometimes he'd just stand there watching me move around the kitchen, a grin spreading across his face. "I still can't believe it," he'd say. Me neither. I'd answer, though the truth was, I'd stopped trying to explain it. There were no words big enough for what had happened. Friends and neighbors came by to see for themselves. Some hugged me so tight I thought they'd knock me off my feet. Others just stood back, tears in their eyes, whispering, "Thank God." I noticed something in David, too. It wasn't just relief or happiness. It was a deeper calm, like he'd been carrying a weight for years and could finally set it down. I realized he hadn't just been fighting for my recovery. He'd been fighting for me to believe again. Faith was a tricky thing for me before that day. I'd kept God at a polite distance, like a neighbor I'd wave to but never invite inside. That Sunday changed all of that. It wasn't just about my legs. It was about hope, the kind that survives when logic says it shouldn't. Sometimes late at night, I think back to the moment the preacher said, "Today is the last day you'll be in that chair." He hadn't hesitated, hadn't stumbled over the words. He'd spoken like he was describing something that had already happened, and maybe in God's eyes it had. Now, Months later, I can do things I thought were gone forever. I fix things around the house. I take short walks in the park. And every Sunday, David and I sit together in the front row of that church. Do I still have questions? Sure. Do I understand how or why it happened to me? Not entirely. But I know this. I'm walking. And every step I take feels like a promise kept. If you've listened this far, maybe you're facing your own version of that wheelchair, something that feels immovable, unchangeable. I'm here to tell you, don't stop believing that change is possible. I don't know your story, but I know this. You're not alone. If my story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope today. And if you want to hear more true stories like this one, subscribe and join me on this journey. Because miracles still happen. And sometimes they happen when you least expect them.